If this reflection on self-doubt and finding strength in maturity resonates with the quiet fear in your own heart, I ask you to do one small thing before we go further. Share this profound journey of finding purpose with one person you know who is currently searching for their own clarity in life's second act. They call me the liberator now, the prophet, the one whose face still retains a certain glow after communing on the mountaintop. But if you could hear the ringing, desolate silence after the cloud of fire lifts, if you could see the truth in the dark, frayed corners of this tent, you would know my hands still tremble. They tremble not from the impossible weight of the stone tablets, but from the crushing, exhausting weight of expectation that accompanies this long, unending journey. I'm well past 80 years of age, yet every morning I wake up to the same cold, quiet terror, that they will all finally realize I'm still just a stuttering runaway shepherd. The miracles, they are merely spectacular footnotes to the perpetual gnawing fear that I am in my core inherently inadequate. I still carry the heart of a frightened man who murdered in panic and then fled into the void of the desert, and I never truly left that void. This staff, this rod of power, it burns my palm not with divine energy but with the shame of its necessity, a constant reminder that I require external proof of worth to function. I look out at the camp, a million souls stirring restlessly in their tents, and I see the stark reflection of my own exhaustion in their demanding, dissatisfied eyes. They see the mountain, they see the law, they see the miraculous food arriving every dawn. They do not see the man who carries a burden too heavy for mere bone and blood, the anxiety of endless provision. This maturity, this so-called second act of my life that promised wisdom, it brought not clarity or peace, but an immense, unbearable responsibility that ages the spirit faster than time ages the body. Did you truly believe that turning 50, 60, or 80 would suddenly make the piercing voice of doubt in your mind quiet down? I assure you, it simply learns to whisper louder, more sophisticated lies. It tells you now, with the authority of decades, this is your final chance to fail, Moses, and you, the flawed, fearful man, are destined to take it. The anxiety is a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the sounds of the murmuring camp. It is the existential dread of being publicly exposed, the deep-seated terror that the next challenge, not the sea, not the pharaoh, but the next trivial demand for water, or the next foolish crisis of faith from this stiff-necked people, will be the precise moment that finally breaks me, because the people in their hurried human way are quick to forget the victory. They only remember the discomfort and the thirst of the present moment. And I am just as quick to forget the infinite source of my power, remembering only my own lack, my own human weakness, my own temper that simmers just below the surface. Every day, I measure myself against the impossible standard of the magnificent role I play. They teach children about the burning bush, about the incredible moment the voice called me forth from the anonymity of herding sheep. But they rarely tell you that the power didn't miraculously erase the tremor in my voice or the self-hatred in my heart. It amplified them both, demanding I speak louder, demanding I perform flawlessly on the world's largest, most unforgiving stage. And performance, sustained over decades, is spiritually and emotionally devastating. It is the deep, silent burnout of having to be magnificent and infallible every single day, while deep down you just yearn to go back to the quiet, forgiving anonymity of the Midian fields. That peace, that simple solitude, that glorious anonymity, that is the greatest, most profound luxury I ever lost when I answered that call. The moment before the sea parted was easy. It was singular, directed, and clear. The endless, grinding years after the sea parted, that is the true punishing test of spiritual endurance. It is the slow, grinding erosion of the soul that comes from constant provision and constant ingratitude, not from overwhelming tragedy. I am tired of being the unstable, vulnerable bridge between the terrifyingly sacred and the eternally skeptical. I am profoundly tired of being the vessel for the miracle. I long to be the man who simply watches the sunrise, not the one who must constantly command a path through the wilderness, constantly proving his worthiness for the role he was given at the age when others retire. This self-doubt is not a temporary lapse in faith. It is a chronic spiritual condition. It is a wound from my youth in Pharaoh's court, from my crime and from my exile that never truly healed, merely being concealed by the temporary bandages of my latest accomplishments. And those accomplishments, they are now just heavier, sharper stones I must carry across the endless, scorching desert. If you find yourself in your middle years, outwardly successful, yet inwardly paralyzed by the fear that you're about to be discovered as a fraud, or that your internal resources are simply exhausted, know that even the ones whose names fill the sacred texts feel the relentless, searing heat of that internal desert. This journey requires everything, and I feel I have nothing left to give. But the most difficult truth to face, the one I carry into this solitude tonight, is this. I still expect someone to come and tap me on the shoulder, relieving me of this crushing staff and the title I never truly earned. I still wait for the replacement, the true worthy leader, because I still fundamentally believe, after all these years and all these incredible wonders, that I am merely standing in for the man who God really meant to choose. This lack of self-acceptance is my deepest, oldest failure. The desert is not merely a place, it is a profound state of being, and it has settled deep within my bones. You might assume that after the parting of the sea, after the thunderous decree on Sinai, after seeing the glory of the divine, the human soul would be inoculated against despair. Yet here is the secret I guard most fiercely. The victories only deepened the silence within me. I was thrust into this monumental role, a conduit of the infinite, but the sheer duration of the task has worn me down to a hollow shell. 40 years I spent as a shepherd in Midian, and 40 more I've spent as a shepherd to these stiff-necked people. 80 years of wilderness. And I realize with a chilling clarity that the desert is not outside the camp. It is tragically housed in my own eyes. I look at the miraculous manna and see only another 20 years of demanding mouths to feed, another 20 years of my own insufficient strength stretched thin until it breaks. My crisis is not one of faith in God. That is a constant, unwavering star. My crisis is the devastating collapse of faith in myself, the instrument. The external world sees a man of bronze, a formidable figure etched in history, but internally the temple is crumbling. It is dust and echoing emptiness. I wake up sometimes and can't recall why I even try. The sheer repetitive cycle of provision and complaint, of miracle and doubt, feels less like a grand mission and more like a punishment designed specifically to test the limits of human patience, and I am failing the test. This gnawing feeling, this profound loss of purpose in the very act of fulfilling my purpose, is the most refined form of despair I have ever known. It is the chilling realization that my life's most defining successes have not brought me peace, but rather a greater, sharper proximity to my own profound exhaustion. I struggle with the cruel irony of being the deliverer who cannot deliver himself from this mental exhaustion. The people crave certainty. They yearn for the flesh pots of Egypt, a return to a known slavery over a frightening freedom. And what do I yearn for? I yearn for the simple clarity of that moment at the bush, when the command was terrifying but singular. Now, the commands are daily, messy, and entangled with human politics, jealousy, and the unending bureaucracy of a traveling nation. I have lost the ability to distinguish the sacred burden from the self-imposed one, and the result is this heavy, pervasive fatigue that settles over my spirit like a thick shroud. It's the kind of fatigue that success doesn't cure, because the success itself is the source of the draining responsibility that follows. This feeling, this cold dread, is what happens when a monumental task is stretched into a lifetime commitment. It becomes a crisis of meaning, not mere logistics. Why did the Eternal choose the least capable, the slow of speech, the one so clearly prone to anger and doubt? Was it a cosmic joke, or was my very imperfection the point? I wrestle with this question daily, and the silence of the heavens on this matter is often deafening. My failure to internalize my own worthiness is, I realize, my own deepest, most enduring desert. Every law I engrave, every judgment I render, feels like another performance to compensate for the man I know myself to be. Impulsive, temperamental, and perpetually weary of this enormous mantle of leadership I was forced to wear late in life. I try to recall the man I was before the burning bush, that shepherd, content in the rhythm of the desert, and I grieve his loss. He was simple, silent, and at peace. The prophet is complex, loud, and constantly on the brink of shattering. I describe my state now as a controlled despair. I cannot afford to break in public, so I break slowly, internally, every time I must lift this staff and demand belief from a skeptical world. This emotional compression is suffocating. It is the anxiety of realizing that the entire grand experiment rests upon your shoulders, and that your own internal resources, your joy, your patience, your hope, have been depleted to serve a greater, impersonal cause. I look at my people, and then I look at the distant hills, and I wonder what it would feel like to simply walk away, to step off the stage, to cease being the necessary instrument. This desire for abandonment is my deepest shame and my most honest prayer. It is the terrifying truth that the great achievements of my life, the liberation, the covenant, have not built me up, but instead have revealed the enormous, unfillable deficit of self-worth that I have carried since my youth. I'm the leader of millions, yet I cannot lead my own heart out of this shadow. I feel unworthy of the task, unworthy of the rest, and entirely unworthy of the promised land I am marching toward. My friends, if you recognize this struggle, the struggle to persevere when your internal resources are spent, when the title doesn't match the tiredness, then you must stay with me. This journey through the desert of the soul is long, but it has a turning point. Do not turn away now. The most crucial revelation, the hard-won clarity that comes only from facing this profound exhaustion, is still ahead. The hardest choice I make every morning is not where to lead the column of marchers, nor which dispute between neighbors to judge, but which mask to wear. You see the prophet, but that is a highly edited, meticulously curated performance perfected over decades of fear. The man who speaks to the divine must appear unshakable, transcendent, almost inhuman. But I assure you, to maintain that facade, to be the God-man when I felt deeply shamefully human, that required a sacrifice far greater than any I asked of the people. I sacrificed myself. I had to bury the impulsive young prince, the fearful shepherd, the stuttering boy, because the Israelite nation could not follow a man riddled with doubt. They needed a symbol of unwavering certainty, and I played the part, knowing the cost of that deception was the complete and utter loss of my own authentic internal voice. This constant performance, this requirement of infallibility, is the root of the burnout I described. To lead means to absorb every fear, every complaint, every act of ingratitude, and to transmute it into calm, authoritative reassurance. But what happens to the man who is the receptacle for all that negative energy? He cracks. I was the bridge between a wholly unapproachable power and a desperately flawed people, and the intense current of that connection eventually overloaded me. It wasn't the logistical stress of feeding millions, it was the emotional compression. I had to pretend that their constant whining didn't hurt me, that their yearning for Egyptian slavery didn't sting me as a profound personal failure of leadership and influence. I had to remain the bronze statue when all I was inside was a brittle piece of clay longing for rest and understanding. This necessity to appear perfect is what led to my greatest failure, the striking of the rock. You might assume it was a moment of fleeting rage against a perpetually frustrating people, and indeed, that anger was present. But the deeper, colder truth is that it was a moment of absolute, total exhaustion and resentment against the role itself. I was so drained from being the intermediary, so weary of having to continuously prove the miraculous nature of this journey, that I lashed out at the symbol of the burden itself. I was supposed to speak to the rock, showing gentle obedience. Instead, I hit it, demanding the water come forth. It wasn't about the water. It was the raw, unadulterated frustration of a leader who was drowning in his own forced strength, wanting desperately to be allowed a moment of human weakness, a moment to say, "I can't do this anymore." I confess now that the striking of that rock wasn't just a theological error. It was a desperate, self-destructive cry for help. It was the only way I knew to break the cycle, to force a consequence, to perhaps force a moment where God or the people would finally see the exhausted, fallible man beneath the luminous mask. The price for being the people's icon was the loss of my own spiritual inheritance, my entrance into the promised land. And while the cost was devastating, part of me, the part that was desperately tired of the performance, felt a perverse sense of relief. The punishment, the barring from the final victory, meant the end of the impossible responsibility. It was a dark, selfish freedom born from burnout. If you are a person of a certain age who has built a career, raised a family, or led an institution, you know this feeling intimately. You know the crushing weight of the facade, the smiling executive, the unflappable parent, the unwavering rock of your community, and the immense, silent cost of maintaining that image. You too have struck the rock in your own way, perhaps through a burst of anger, a self-sabotaging choice, or a moment of total emotional collapse in private. We carry the collective hope and anxiety of others, and it burns us up from the inside out. My vulnerability in that moment was my downfall, yet it was the most human, most honest thing I had done in years. I had hoped that in my maturity the confidence would arrive, the certainty that I was finally worthy of this colossal task. Instead, the task grew, and my internal resources shrunk. I realized that the self-hatred, the belief that I was a fraud who would soon be exposed, was a more tenacious enemy than Pharaoh and his entire army. The wilderness, the manna, the law, they all tested the Israelites' faith. But the prolonged exposure to this magnificent role tested mine, proving that the self-punishment for past mistakes is often the heaviest stone we choose to carry, long after we have been forgiven by the divine. This struggle to reconcile the magnificent role with the miserable man is crucial to understanding how we survive the second act of life. It's about more than just leadership. It's about the shame that keeps us imprisoned. I know this shame has haunted you too. If you are ready to explore the deeper truth about self-forgiveness and legacy, please consider subscribing to this channel now. Your journey toward clarity deserves this support. The moment of total surrender is rarely cinematic. It is usually just numb. You might imagine that after the incident with the rock, a blazing chariot descended, or a voice thundered from the heavens to scold me. Instead, there was just silence, a terrifying, profound absence of divine instruction, a quiet that seemed to mock the tumult in my soul. This was my true dark night, not on a stormy mountain, but right here, in the oppressive ordinariness of the desert evening, after realizing the ultimate consequence of my emotional collapse. I would not cross into the promised land. The banishment wasn't accompanied by wrath, it was accompanied by an empty finality that left me utterly exposed. I stopped fighting, stopped arguing, stopped pleading for a reversal, and simply stared into the vast, indifferent darkness beyond the campfires. What I saw was a man who had completed a nearly impossible journey only to lose the meaning of the destination itself. In that terrible, serene quiet, the voice of the Eternal did not speak to me from a fire or a cloud, but through the realization of the absolute emptiness of my own ego. I had spent decades defining myself by my action, by striking, by leading, by mediating, and suddenly all those definitions were stripped away. The law was written. The people were being guided by others, Aaron's family, Joshua. The immense pressure of the doing was momentarily lifted, and what remained was a frightening vacuum, a man without a title or a future territory. It was the forced encounter with the unvarnished self. My achievements, which had once been my armor against self-doubt, became nothing more than hollow echoes in the desert air. My fear was that if I wasn't the prophet, I was nobody, and the desert's silence seemed to confirm that terrifying assessment. It was a profound, agonizing period of internal reckoning, similar to what many of you face when you retire from a career, or when your children finally leave the nest, or when a massive life goal is achieved and the adrenaline fades. The structure that defined you collapses, and you are left with the raw, unprotected core. I remember sitting by myself, the tears finally coming. Not tears of anger or sadness, but tears of pure, unadulterated fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that is spiritual, the weariness that begs for annihilation. I had longed for the promised land as a reward for my diligence, as a validation of my worth, and when that reward was denied, I had to confront the possibility that my worth was not, and never had been, tied to the achievement itself. This was the moment I stopped looking outward for validation and began the terrifying descent inward. This descent forced me to re-examine my entire history, not as the grand narrative told around the campfires, but as a series of flawed, human choices. The murder in Egypt, the flight, the stutter, the rage at the rock, they weren't just mistakes, they were intrinsic parts of me. I had always believed that these parts were blemishes that needed to be surgically removed by success. Now forced into stillness, I realized that the divine power had chosen and used the entire man, flaws and all, and that my striving for personal perfection was an unnecessary, self-inflicted torture. I had been resisting the plan, not by rebelling, but by constantly compensating for the man God had actually called. The struggle was not against Pharaoh, but against my refusal to accept my own brokenness. In the midst of this vacuum, a truth emerged, quiet and steady, like the deep breath taken after weeping. The purpose was never about arrival or perfection, it was about process and presence. I had been so focused on being the heroic deliverer that I had forgotten the simple mandate: to show up, to listen, and to obey the very next instruction. The ultimate clarity I sought did not come from a dazzling display of power, but from the realization that my value was not measured by the miles we marched or the water we found, but by the fact that I showed up for the journey when I was tired, when I doubted, and when I was afraid. The worthiness was in the courage to be present despite the doubt. I realized then that my great failure at the rock was not in hitting it, but in believing that the entire mission depended solely on my personal strength and control. My pride had been in my endurance, my unique ability to handle the pressure. When I broke, I was forced to acknowledge that the power was never my own, and that was the true moment of liberation. The purpose of my life was to be a channel, not the source, and a channel, even if cracked, still serves its function. This realization broke my resistance to self-acceptance, opening a small, vital window for healing. My friends, if you are currently in your own point of silence, if the structure of your life has collapsed and you are staring into the intimidating void of the future, questioning your identity, remember this lesson. The purpose of the silence is to strip away the noise of your performance so that you can hear the whisper of your true, enduring worth. If this conversation has given you a moment of stillness and clarity, please do something simple yet profound. Take a deep breath. Leave a single word in the comments that describes your current internal state, and let's share this burden of honesty together. The truth that finally emerged from the deep silence of my internal collapse was anticlimactic, and for that very reason, profoundly liberating. I had always assumed that the great revelation, the clarity I sought in my maturity, would be a new grand mandate, a bigger mountain to climb, a new sea to part, another impossible act of proof. Instead, the whisper that came was utterly simple, devoid of thunder. Your purpose was never about your performance, Moses. It was about your presence and the preparation of others. I realized, with staggering relief, that my primary role had shifted from the glorious public doer to the quiet, dignified preparer. The weight dropped when I accepted that my worth was not tied to being the one who would lead the people into the promised land, but rather to being the weary, flawed man who simply ensured they had the law, the structure, and the strength to get there without me. This was the non-heroic discovery of my second act, the profound liberation that comes when you recognize that your greatest achievement is not what you build, but whom you mentor and the spirit you foster in those who continue the long, arduous march. The grand achievements of my past, the plagues, the exodus, the thunderous covenant, were the tumultuous preamble. The true purpose of my final decades, I understood, was not defined by new feats of strength, but by a meticulous transmission of legacy. My job now was to distill the fire and the fear of Sinai into digestible, enduring wisdom, ensuring the next generation did not repeat our crushing mistakes. I had to teach Joshua, the strong, silent warrior, how to hear the still, small voice, and how to lead with vulnerability, not just force. This quiet, intentional act of teaching became my greatest joy, a restorative balm to the soul burned out by public spectacle. It is a subtle, almost invisible role, this cultivation of the future, yet it possesses a power far deeper than any command I ever shouted over the sea. This shift from performing miracles to preserving the teaching is the essential transition of maturity that frees the soul from the tyranny of its own expectations. The beauty of this new, subtle role lies in its simplicity. I no longer needed to carry the entire weight of the world on my staff. My strength was now best utilized in ensuring the foundations were solid for the next builders. My worth was established not in defying a pharaoh, but in patiently explaining the complexities of justice and mercy to a skeptical heart. This wisdom, distilled from 40 years of failure and endurance, is the true reward of the desert. It is the realization that the best use of a life spent in monumental struggle is to ensure that the path is slightly less treacherous for those who follow. I finally saw that the strength of my legacy was directly proportional to the humility of my exit, the grace with which I prepared to hand over the responsibility. This acceptance brought a peace that the mightiest miracle never could, because it was a peace born not of victory, but of genuine, quiet self-acceptance. This revelation holds an immense lesson for those of you who find yourselves in the prime of life, successful but searching for renewed meaning. You believe your purpose is still to be the central pillar, the one everyone relies upon for solutions and miracles. I urge you to look closer. The most powerful phase of your life, the phase of true, enduring influence, is the phase of presence. It is the moment you accept that your best years are not for proving your competence, but for imparting your competence. Your anxiety diminishes when you realize that your struggle was not a failure, but the very crucible that created the unique wisdom you possess, wisdom which only you can now pass on. Stop chasing the next impossible achievement and instead invest your considerable hard-won resources into the simple, powerful act of mentorship and true, attentive presence in the lives that matter most. The profound truth is that my flaws, the stuttering voice, the youthful impulsiveness, the deep-seated anger, were not just hindrances to overcome. They were essential components of the divine's plan. Had I been the flawless, eloquent, perfect leader, the people would have followed my personality, not the covenant. My brokenness, my visible human frailty, forced them to look beyond me, to look to the source of the power itself. I was chosen not despite my brokenness, but because of it, to demonstrate that the divine current can flow even through a cracked, flawed vessel. This is the hard-won wisdom distilled from the intense suffering of chronic self-doubt. Your resilience is not measured by your ability to avoid falling, but by the quiet power you find in showing up, broken, day after day, and still pointing to the greater truth. My journey shifted from seeking a reward, the land, the glory, to embracing the true reward, which is understanding. I finally gained the profound understanding that I was never meant to possess the promise. I was meant to faithfully guide others toward it. The purpose of my maturity became the acceptance of my own limitations and the celebration of the future I would never physically inhabit. This acceptance required me to forgive the young man who struck the rock and to realize that the punishment was simply the removal of the impossible burden I had placed upon myself. The peace is in the letting go, in recognizing that the story of my life is complete, even without the triumphant final chapter I once demanded. This wisdom, the shift from a focus on personal achievement to a commitment to quiet legacy, is too valuable to keep confined. If this message has begun to reshape your understanding of your own second act, and you want to continue receiving this type of deep, life-affirming spiritual and mental clarity, I urge you to join our dedicated community on our exclusive email list. The journey is long, but we must walk the path to self-acceptance together, sharing the insights that only maturity can provide. If you are standing where I once stood, exhausted by the weight of expectations, convinced that the best part of your life is already behind you, and paralyzed by the fear of never being enough, I want to give you the map I discovered in the shadow of my own great failure. This journey through the desert teaches us that the greatest act of courage in maturity is the ability to gracefully transfer the burden. My strength, which I once defined by how long I could hold the staff, is now defined by the courage with which I trained Joshua to take it. Your second act is not about clinging desperately to the stage, but about the art of making a dignified, purposeful exit. True resilience in this phase is the capacity to transition from being the indispensable hero to the foundational mentor, embracing the quiet power of the unseen contribution. Stop measuring your purpose by the applause you receive, and start measuring it by the quality of the legacy you intentionally craft for those who follow your path. The wisdom gleaned from 40 years of wandering is this: the perceived weakness, the gagera that plagued my speech and my confidence, was not a defect, but a necessary feature. It forced me to rely on others, specifically Aaron, and later Joshua, preventing me from becoming a dictator who ruled by pure charisma. It ensured the mission was never about the man, but about the message. You must look at your own imperfections, the emotional fragility, the temper, the moments you feel completely inadequate, and understand that they are the very things that make you authentic and therefore relatable and ultimately effective as a guide. Do not allow your past failures to fuel your present self-punishment. Let them fuel your compassion and your capacity to teach. Your brokenness is not a sign of defeat. It is the unique signature of your perseverance, the proof that you have endured and still stand. I urge you to adopt the mindset of the preparer, not the possessor. My greatest peace came when I accepted I would not possess the promised land. My purpose was solely to prepare the people for it. Your true legacy does not lie in the wealth you accumulate or the titles you hold, but in the spirit of perseverance you instill in the next generation. This requires a profound act of humility, the willingness to step back and watch others succeed where you could not, or where you chose not to venture. Focus on simplifying your mission, shedding the unnecessary complexities and the need for external validation that drove your earlier, more volatile years. The goal now is clarity of spirit, not accumulation of achievement. It is about distilling your life's fire into a gentle, guiding light. If you are struggling with the relentless anxiety of performance, the kind that demands you always be the best, the smartest, the most decisive, then you must practice the radical act of passing the mantle. Teach someone everything you know, even the painful, ugly truths. In that act of genuine transference, you realize the knowledge itself, the wisdom, is the enduring power, not the hand that wields the staff. This transition is not a demotion, it is an elevation to a higher, more sustainable form of influence. It is the crucial mental and spiritual step that liberates the mature soul from the crushing fear of sudden obsolescence. You move from being the limited resource to being the infinite wellspring. Embrace the quiet force of perseverance without fanfare. For 40 years, the victory was found in waking up every morning and putting one tired foot in front of the other. It was the resilience born of silence, the determination forged in ingratitude. Your struggle with self-doubt is not a unique curse. It is the universal human condition. The trick is to show up anyway, tired, uncertain, and deeply flawed, and to let your actions be the proof of the message, not your words. Stop waiting for the moment when you feel fully ready, fully confident, or perfectly healed. The journey requires the man you are today, with all the remaining cracks and scars. That is the authenticity that finally resonates. The map for your new beginning does not lead backward to repair old mistakes, nor does it lead to a mythical land of perfect rest. It leads inward. It demands that you accept the price of your own strength, the burnout, the loneliness, the public scrutiny, and transform that price into the wisdom that guides others. Forgive the younger version of yourself who demanded perfection, and forgive the version of yourself who hit the rock. The only way to find your renewed purpose is to accept that your entire flawed history was the training ground. You are not defined by the one thing you lost, but by the multitude of things you faithfully carried through the wilderness. Your final act must be defined by peace, not performance. To continue this necessary work of self-forgiveness and legacy building, it requires active participation, not just passive listening. I urge you to take this internal map and begin sharing it with your network. Find this video's link and share it on your most used platform, Facebook, LinkedIn, or your private group chat. Let us amplify this message that strength in maturity comes from accepting our own profound humanity. The path to peace, I have discovered, is the path of acceptance, acceptance of the journey's end, acceptance of the self, and acceptance of the final, unchangeable facts of a life lived fully. As I stand now, alone on the final mountain of my life, Mount Nebo, looking out over the territory I will never walk, there is no bitterness. There is only a profound, crystalline clarity, a stillness I have craved since I first stood before the burning bush. The final lesson of the desert is that true resolution is not found in achieving a desired outcome, but in finding profound meaning in the direction you faithfully pointed others toward. My life was not diminished by being barred from the promised land. It was completed by the singular, sustained act of guidance. I am the exhausted man who ensured the way was clear, and in that duty I found a dignity that no title or territory could ever confer. This is the ultimate freedom of maturity, the letting go of the need for personal validation through grand, final achievements. I finally understand that the true promised land I was meant to discover was not an external, geographical location, but the internal state of self-acceptance I now carry. It is the peace that comes from knowing you showed up. You persisted through the crushing self-doubt, and you fulfilled your unique, albeit flawed role in the larger tapestry. I look over those rolling hills, and I am filled with gratitude for the sight, even if the walk is not mine to take. This visual farewell is my final act of obedience, the ultimate quiet surrender that transforms anxiety into serenity. It is the moment I finally stop comparing the man I am to the prophet I was forced to become, recognizing that they were always the same, imperfect vessel, simply being used for an immeasurably greater purpose than either could comprehend. For those of you carrying the weariness of a long life lived with intense scrutiny and internal doubt, this is the truth I leave with you. Your maturity is not a decline, it is a distillation. All the trials, all the mistakes, all the moments you felt like an utter fraud, they were not obstacles to your purpose, but the fuel that forged your wisdom. Use this wisdom not to judge yourself or others, but to build bridges of understanding. The purpose of your second act is to trade the exhausting burden of the need to be flawless for the serene power of being foundational. Lay the stones for the next generation. Offer your presence and your hard-won clarity, and find your daily joy in the simple, continuous act of showing up. I no longer feel the need to argue with the divine about my worthiness. The simple fact is that I am here on this mountain, having completed the most arduous journey, and that is enough. Your value is not defined by the one thing you failed to achieve or the one instance you succumbed to human frailty, but by the extraordinary totality of your efforts, the enduring spirit that brought you to this very moment. Stop demanding perfection from your past self. Instead, look at the survivor you are today and honor the deep, scarred resilience that brought you through the wilderness of fear and failure. Your scars are not marks of shame, they are the topographical map of your transcendence. My final act, standing here, is one of deep, abiding encouragement for you. You are entering a phase of life where the external noise should finally quiet down, allowing the enduring, constant hum of your true self to be heard. Do not retreat into apathy. Instead, embrace this time as the most powerful and influential season of your life, precisely because you have nothing left to prove and everything to impart. The greatest thing you can give the world now is the wisdom born of your exhaustion, the compassion honed by your self-doubt, and the clarity purchased at the high price of your public failures. Do not squander this hard-won spiritual maturity. Now, as I prepare to hand the staff over completely, not with resentment but with peace, I invite you to make a final, active commitment to your own new dawn. I ask you to use your voice, the one you were always afraid was too weak or too flawed, to engage with this community. Leave a comment sharing the single, most important wisdom you have gained from your own wilderness years. Let us build a shared legacy of resilience and purpose for all who follow. And so, the journey ends, but the purpose remains, carried forward not by the exhausted hands of the prophet, but by the new life he helped create. The true promised land, I realize now, is not a place you arrive at, but the state of grace you inhabit when you finally accept yourself fully. I have seen the land, I have found my peace. Closing phrase, profound and final. Aged 120, I finally understood that I never needed to be God to be enough.